I would like to ask former judge. She retired from the Supreme Court. She became the president of the Press Council. I'd like to ask her to give introductory remarks to the panel that will follow. We just little housekeeping here, which is a good time to remind you of the culinary tour, 8:45, Bite Mojo, the application, and we'll see you there. And now, Justice Dorner, please. From here. Okay.
Okay.
1 second. Let him just.
Okay. Well, we must speak about press freedom under Trump and Netanyahu. Now, a freedom of the press watchdog recently compared Netanyahu to Donald Trump while accusing both leaders of setting back journalistic liberties in their countries. However, there is a big difference between the United States and the State of Israel. Israel has no First Amendment, nor a strong belief in free speech. The freedom of speech is not protected by a constitution. Our democracy is weak. It lacks proper checks and balances. Our basic laws are not entrenched, so that the governing majority has the power to change the rules of the game, and in doing so, to gain control over our democratic institutions, the courts, the media, and our civil society. Governing majorities have not yet used this power because of political entrenchment. The ruling coalitions have consisted of at least one liberal party, which has prevented the erosion of our democracy. But times have changed. Today, members of the political leadership, headed by Netanyahu, compete with one another for public opinion by bashing the media. Netanyahu's attack on the media in general, and on journalists in particular, is motivated more than personal vendetta. It is part of the broader effort of the right-wing government to control the judiciary, the reporting of news, and the entire public discourse. In short, the freedom of press is at risk. Now, Israel is an open society where we enjoy an independent judiciary and a vibrant and pluralistic media. However, the situation has become dangerous. I believe that sadly, Israel is facing a real threat to its democracy. And I don't mean formal democracy. I mean substantive democracy, real democracy. We must remember that one clear indication of the importance of a free press is that the first action taken by undemocratic regimes is to silence critical voices in the media. It can be done also by influencing the public opinion. And George Orwell dwelt on it. In his preface to his book Animal Farm, he wrote that the chief danger to freedom of thought and speech is not the direct interference of the government, but rather intellectual cowardice, the fear of public opinion. Unpopular ideas can be silenced, and inconvenient facts can be kept dark without the need for an official ban. Therefore, at the end of the day, the most important factor that can protect the free press is public opinion. Unfortunately, large segments of our society are influenced by the attacks on the media. Accordingly, a survey conducted by the Israeli Democratic Institute found that only 24% of Israelis trust the media, reflecting an 11.5 drop from last year. While other factors may have precipitated this drop, the fact is that it is correlated with the personal attacks by Netanyahu on the media. So nowadays, the main objectives of the Israeli Press Council are to influence public opinion by explaining the importance of free press to every citizen, notwithstanding his or her political opinion, and defending the media and the journalists personally against attacks by the political leadership in general, and Netanyahu in particular. The battle for freedom of speech must and will continue.
Thank you very much, Justice Betatik. Thank you very much, Justice Dorner. Brief as usual and to the point. Thank you very much for your significant speech. And now I'd like to invite our panelists, Professor Mordechai Kremnitzer, Vice President of the Israel Democracy Institute, and Professor Fred Lawrence, former President of Brandeis and Professor of Law at Yale, and more other important positions, and Ruth Eglash, correspondent of the Washington Post in Israel, who will moderate. Please.
So each of the panel have asked to give some opening comments and to speak to introduce their thesis and their views on press freedom. So I'm going to hand it over to.
Should we do it from here or from the podium?
Whatever you prefer.
Here is good. Sure.
Yeah.
Justice Dorner has given us a good place to start, I think. Your suggestion that Israel does not have a First Amendment, the United States does, I will suggest that's not going to solve all our problems, but it is a good point of departure. And you mentioned checks and balances, and that's really where I wish to begin. The American system of government is famous for its system being based on checks and balances, going back to the very founding and the Constitution, drawing on Montesquieu and others. The idea was to separate power within the federal government, famously among the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, and that these branches would act as a check and balance on each other. And to a large extent they have, and we've seen it in very dramatic moments in American history. Not all that long ago for some of us, there was the remarkable moment when the Supreme Court of the United States tells President Nixon to turn over tapes that the president knows are incriminating, that the president knows will mark the end of his term. The Supreme Court unanimously orders him to turn over the tapes, and two remarkable things happen. The less remarkable is that he does turn over the tapes. The most remarkable piece is that no one was surprised when he did. It never crossed anyone's mind, most people's minds, that the commander-in-chief of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines, are the most powerful military force on the world's stage, would say to the Supreme Court, no. Never occurred to us. And indeed, he didn't. He did say yes. He did turn over the tapes, and within a week, he had resigned as President of the United States, the only president to resign from office. So to a certain extent, that check and balance works. But the checks and balances, in fact, go well beyond just the branches of the federal government. And that goes to the very structure of the government. Next in sort of the level of obvious checks and balances is the states and the federal government, what we call the division of powers between the federal government and the state government. But more to the point for today is that the Constitution and then the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, passed just several years after the Constitution, known to us today as the Bill of Rights, created quite intentionally, quite purposefully, several different separate concentrations of power and authority and legitimacy. And these were enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and I think should be thought of as part of this notion of a separation of powers and part of the broadest notion of checks and balances. So thought of that way, the protection of religious institutions in the First Amendment is a part of creating within the society a separate set of authority centers within civil society. This is not my great insight. This goes back as far as de Tocqueville, who, when he came to the United States in the early, not quite mid-19th century, was particularly struck not so much by the government of America, but by civil society and by the roles of religious institutions as sources of civil authority and of actual power within the society. The fact that that's protected by the First Amendment from government interference is an example of another kind of check. Obviously, the next one, and the one I want to focus on, is the free press. The protection of the free press in the First Amendment creates another such center of power. Want to go back in time just briefly before the Constitution to one of the other forming documents of our time, much hotter now that the musical Hamilton is all over the world. No one knew who Alexander Hamilton was before other than the fellow on the $10 bill. Now the musical was so successful they couldn't get him off the $10 bill. One of the more remarkable little achievements of that musical. But it has also brought the Federalist Papers back to very close attention to many of us. Federalist Papers were a set of articles that were written in order to try to influence the ratification of the Constitution. This is what Hamilton said at the time in Federalist 84 about why the Constitution did not protect a free press. This would be done several years later in the Bill of Rights. But he said that not only does it not need to be done, but it would be dangerous to do that. Now, why did he say it would be dangerous for the Constitution to do that? He said there's nothing in the Constitution that permits the interference with the free press. Therefore, the government doesn't have the authority to do it. Right? It seems like kind of a facile argument, but understand what he was saying at the time. He was worried that giving the government even the power to protect the press was dangerous. Here's what he says. Why, for instance, should it be said the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which restriction may be imposed? I will not contend that such a provision would confer a regulating power, but it is evident that it would furnish to men disposed to usurp a plausible pretense for claiming that power. So he took it as so obvious, the need for a free press, that he was even concerned about giving the Constitution the protection of the press. The very act of protecting it suggested a line that would be drawn. Let me take this from Hamilton's time up to closer to ours, actually contemporaneous with my other example of Nixon and the tapes, and that is the case of the Pentagon Papers. Before there was WikiLeaks, there was the Pentagon Papers, a detailed history of the military intervention in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, demonstrating that long before anything was made public to the American people, this was an adventure that the military knew was likely not to lead to military success. It would have changed fundamentally the debate over Vietnam had it come out earlier. The New York Times and the Washington Post, your paper, both released these Pentagon Papers that were given to them, and they were immediately sued and enjoined in federal court from publishing them. This went up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court famously ordered that the Pentagon Papers could be published, that they could not be, the papers could not be restrained from publishing them. The man who argued the case for the New York Times was a law professor at Yale named Alexander Bickel, one of the great figures of American law of that period. Bickel said something very interesting after the case was decided. When he was asked, was he gratified that the Supreme Court had found in his favor and had ordered that the press was allowed to be free and was allowed to publish these works, he said, "We are less free today for the very fact that this line has now been drawn." We are less free today for the fact that this line has been drawn. Because the very fact that this line has been drawn suggests there is some area where you could repress the press. So why was this considered such a serious matter? I believe it is built into the very constitutional structure. The press is key to being another one of these centers of authority, centers of accountability, and centers of legitimacy. But beyond being a, if you will, equal center of authority with the federal government's three branches, with the state government, with religious institutions. Academic freedom, which seems to have an implied home in the First Amendment, creates universities all over the United States, which are also sources of authority and accountability. What makes the press different is that on top of its normal role of being a place of legitimacy and a place of power, there is the ultimate function of playing the role of maintaining transparency that is absolutely essential to a governing, self-governing democracy. The founders understood that, and that is what has animated the role of a free press. That is why part and parcel of this structure has been an understanding that all of these different power centers understand each has a role to play, which is actually to say a subtle and very important point. It's to say the thing itself is not any one of those branches. Even the government itself is not the ultimate thing itself. The thing itself is the liberal democracy, is the functioning society that requires all of these elements. So one core element to a functioning liberal democracy is that all of these power centers have to understand the role of the other. A second has to be a core commitment to transparency. We talked about this earlier during the session we just had about the transparency of the views of reporters. We talked about it in an earlier session about contributions to having to be made public as to who is supporting different candidates and who is supporting different causes. So transparency is core. And three, and perhaps most important to the time in which we're living, is the essential understanding that none of these branches, none of these power centers is permitted to seek to delegitimize the other. To attack the other, to criticize the other, that's as old as the Constitution. Look at what John Adams said about the press. Even George Washington in his weak moments criticized the press. But to delegitimize it as an institution, that is a different matter. That is to undo the constitutional structure. What's the bulwark that makes all of this possible? And with this, I leave you not necessarily good news or bad news, merely news. And it does echo Justice Dorner's comment about it is the people's belief in a free press. Here's how Madison put it back in Federalist 84 in the Federalist Papers. He said, "What is the liberty of the press? Who can give it any definition which would not leave the utmost latitude for evasion? I hold it to be impracticable. And from this I infer that the security of the freedom of the press, whatever fine declarations may be inserted in any constitution respecting it, must altogether depend on public opinion and on the general spirit of the people and of the government. And here, after all, as intimated upon other occasions, must we seek for the only true basis for all our rights."
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. And now over to you, Professor Kremnitzer.
Well, I'll follow the line that Professor Lawrence started with by comparing the Israeli case to the US case. And the first point is the system of checks and balances, which is extremely more extremely stronger in the US system than in our system. First of all, because of our parliamentary system, which means that actually there is no significant check on the government from the side of the parliament, because the parliament is actually being governed by the government. So we lose a very important aspect of checks and balances. The second element that we lack because we don't have a constitution is that even a very important checks that we do have, like the judiciary, is not entrenched in any way. Its powers, its ways of appointing can be changed by a regular majority of the parliament. And therefore, while we speak about independence of the judiciary, this independence is limited in a structure in which the powers of the court are not ensured in any way. So this makes the media so crucial in our system of checks and balances. The problem is that we totally lack what you described as a tradition of special respect to free media. The state of Israel was established on the basis of the British mandate. The British mandate had no idea of democratic rule. Its legislation is full with authority for government officials to limit press, to close down newspapers. The idea that a government does not have the authority to limit the media is so far from what we started with. The Supreme Court did a hell of a job in restricting the unlimited powers that our legislation gave to public officials, to the government. With very important decisions, these powers were significantly restricted. But not having a constitution still remains a major issue, and the fact that our basic law, human dignity and liberty, that is a quasi-constitution in the way to a constitution, does not mention free speech at all, and the court had to construct the idea that free speech is covered under human dignity, which I think is a solid basis in our basic law for free speech. But of course, it does not have the explicit standing of being mentioned in the basic law. And then we don't have it at all the idea that this special right is a right that is protected in terms that come close to absoluteness. This we lack entirely. In our legal system, it's a relative right. It can be limited for a worthy purpose in a proportionate way. This is the whole story of the protection of free speech in the state of Israel. So I think it exemplifies how far we are from the United States in the standing and status of free speech. Now, to give one example, 2 years ago, the Knesset passed a law according to which if somebody says that people should not appear, a theater play should not be placed in the settlements in the West Bank, this is a cause for action against the person. The Supreme Court intervened a little bit, limited the provision so that damage has to be proven, but still the idea that you can limit a call to boycott the settlements on performing art, on commerce is something that passed in the Knesset and got the approval in principle of the Supreme Court. Now, to wrap up, what I would like to say is to go back to a distinction that Justice Dorner alluded to. We have a debate in the Israeli society about what is democracy. And there is a lot of support to the idea that democracy is majority rule and nothing else. And everything that you want to add to majority rule is leftist propaganda. So the idea of majority rule exhausts the idea of democracy. It's a very strong, it may sound strange to you or to some of the people in the audience, but there is a lot of support in Israeli society to this view. And there is the other more traditional view about substantive, what Justice Dorner called real democracy. What I want to emphasize is that without free speech, it must not be free speech as protected in the United States, because this is a unique situation. In the United States, free speech is protected more in most other systems in the world. So we must not come exactly to the place that the United States is. But still, if we do not provide for a significant place for free speech, we don't have democracy in the narrow procedural sense. Because without room for all views, facts, discussion, the exercise of going to ballots loses its significance. So even in the narrowest understanding of democracy, without a strong protection of freedom of the speech, you don't have the systems that can be called democracy.
Just so it's clear, in America, we don't protect free speech as much as we do in America either.
Well, thank you to both of you for giving us that introduction, and thank you to Justice Dorner. And I have to say, as a journalist, listening to what all three of you have said, and to the previous panel as well, I'm feeling very worried about my job. And I'm feeling I think a lot of journalists today feel that, especially in Israel and in the US, I mean, I've seen it from both sides. I'm based here. I've been based here for 20 years. And now I work for an American paper, so I'm getting it from both directions. And as journalists, we're very worried. Should we be worried? Are we seeing, as Justice Dorner said, freedom of the press is at risk?
I think yes, I think you're right to be worried. You know, there's the joke about the Jewish son who sends a postcard home to his mother that says, "Start worrying, details to follow." And I find myself watching the news each morning that way. I get up in the morning and I think, start worrying, and then I'll watch the news and see what I should be worrying about. I think I would say that our watchword should be vigilance but not overkill. Mm-hmm. I think the notion of free press being totally compromised in America is overstated. I don't fear for that. What I do fear for is a kind of delegitimization of the press, such as I've not seen in my lifetime. And again, I don't want to be naive about what the past was. President Nixon was at war with the press. President Johnson, in some ways, was at war with the press during Vietnam. And you can go back to the founding presidents. So this is not new, but that's on the merits. Mm-hmm. The notion of saying that the press itself is not legitimate. This notion of that listen to what the leaders say, listen to what the president says, don't pay attention to the press. Right? That is fundamentally inconsistent with a liberal democratic system. I think there is a lot of resistance to that. So that's the reason. That's what I mean by vigilance, not overkill. So I think it's a critical moment. I think it is, in some ways, there are things on the table that we never thought we had. Let me put it this way. 5-10 years ago, if you'd asked me this question, I really would have asked, why are you even asking that? Where's it coming from? Today, I take it as a serious question. Mm-hmm. That said, I think that the stability, ultimately, of a system that's based on a level of freedoms will out.
And in Israel?
Well, I think there is a very good reason to be worried, not to be alarmed or panicked, mm-hmm. but to be worried. In the discussion between Amos Shoken and mm-hmm. Harel in the former session, Amos said that the government does not pay so much attention to the media. And Harel had the opposite view, and I think Harel on this point is right. I think you cannot understand the conduct of the Prime Minister without accepting that he is extremely attentive to the media in a way that is close to an obsession. So I think this is our starting point, that we have a prime minister who is obsessed with the function of the media as a watchdog or a criticism vis-a-vis the government. And this is not something new. It's something that goes with Netanyahu for many years, and it becomes worse with the time. So I think we should be concerned, and one cannot say, like Amos said, well, it's only the prime minister. It's the prime minister. So I think we should be worried, and I think you used the term delegitimization. I think this is one of the worst things that do take place, And for this, you don't have to pass laws or to pull official bans. You create a climate. You attack specific journalists or columnists in a wild way, and you achieve what you want to achieve by this kind of conduct. What we don't see in Israel, and this is increasing our concern, or should increase our concern, we don't see the public standing up against these anti-democratic tendencies. Until now, the public belongs to the United Nations in the sense that it is neutral, objective.
I would say the opposite, actually. I would say the public backs up what the
maybe.
government says and attacks the media, and now the public has all different ways to attack the media through Facebook and Twitter, and actually it's created an environment that both in America and here has created an environment where the public also feels it's able to attack individual journalists, slander people's names, discredit what people write all the time, which always happened, but it was more controlled, and today it can be anywhere from any direction, on Twitter, on Facebook, from everywhere. So I just, you know.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would add that we should be concerned because it is part of general intolerance towards criticism of any sort coming from any source. Courts, the controller of the state, the civil society. No criticism is being accepted as legitimate. Mm-hmm. And if the policy of the government is going to be what it is, which means keeping the status quo vis-à-vis the Palestinians, with increasing criticism from the international community, the concern about delegitimization of the state of Israel will grow. And with this fear from delegitimization comes the will to silence any criticism on the policy of the government. And at first you say, don't do it outside. Mm-hmm. Don't do it in English. But this is a foolish thing. The world is global. Yeah. Hebrew and English are the same. So once you start to in this direction, you will end up with silencing through delegitimization the press.
You raised a point about this question of whether Netanyahu and Trump, I think, is very similar in this. Are they obsessed with the media, or do they need the media, or do they not need the media? I mean, both of those leaders. I mean, people say Trump wakes up in the morning and the first thing he does is send out a tweet. Bibi has his own, YouTube channel, and he makes his own videos. And I've even heard him say he doesn't need the media anymore because he can communicate directly with his public. So the question is, are we seeing a delegitimization of the mainstream media in this way because of social media, or do these leaders still need the mainstream media?
Well, I agree that in the American context, Trump is clearly obsessed with the media. They say that he wakes up, the first thing he does is tweet. Actually, I think he tweets and then he wakes up, and that would explain the early tweets in the middle of the night.
He was watching MSNBC first thing and then tweeting what they were doing.
But the fact, and now all kidding aside, the fact that there are these immediate tweets that respond, even if not ad hominem, to something on the media that do relate to a story on the media, does suggest that's the behavior, that's the pattern. They say he doesn't read, but he certainly watches, and he certainly seems to watch the media. So for someone who says it doesn't matter, he certainly gives it a lot of attention. Yeah. So I think the death of the media is vastly exaggerated. I think the impact continues to be enormous. I think he does worry about it. I think it has been splintered in the sense that there are a lot more sources now for information, and so in that sense there's a leveling. But I wouldn't call it a flattening. I think the so-called legitimate media also has a job to do to earn that. Right? The media can also squander the trust that it asks the public to have. If the media is supposed to be the surrogate for the public's right to know, then there are obligations and responsibilities that come with that. But I think in terms of the government's response, I think the government surely pays attention to it, and obviously those in opposition surely pay attention to it. And one of the things that's been interesting to watch in Washington these days is that the level of leaks out of high-placed people in government into the media is higher than anyone can remember this early in a president's term. It's not unusual late in a president's term that people begin to change their loyalties, or they're beginning to think ahead after the administration. But the first 100, 200 days in, that's usually when everybody is as loyal to the boss as they're going to be, and it's sort of a lockbox environment. And the media has a very hard time getting in.
So the American media is getting used to what the Israeli media is used to.
We can
for a
all
long
learn from
time.
each other.
Yeah.
But it turns out if you don't give direct access, the media will search for indirect access. And I don't think we have suffered from a paucity of information about things going on.
Interesting. And in
It may have to do with the fact that Trump did not finish yet the replacement of the old guard with the new guard. So maybe some of the sources are people who are not his people, and so the question will be, how will the administration act once it's his administration? And then
I think there's something to that. At the same time, some of these leaks are actually unimaginably coming from the White House in ways that are hard to imagine, other than the fact that I think there's enough dissonance within the administration that there seems to be pretty good information coming from pretty high sources. But you're quite right. We've never seen anything like this, to be this far into an administration with so few positions filled, so that you have acting. Wherever you see an acting person in a position, it means a carryover from the past administration. Just yesterday, you had the former Attorney General, an acting Attorney General, testifying before Congress, and she was a holdover from the Obama administration and was the first Attorney General in the Trump administration. So only proving what we always knew, that God has a sense of humor.
You know, you talk about the public's right to know, and you talked about the leaks, and obviously, you know, in a way, you know, for ratings, I think people quite like the kind of leak thing, because it feels like you're getting a scoop or you're getting something unique. But you know, is there the fact that both of these leaders have done things to not share information with the press? I mean, it's well known that Netanyahu doesn't give regular interviews to the Israeli media. There is no like question time. There is no regular press briefings for the Israeli media. And Trump, we've seen you know, some of the mainstream, most well-known media outlets being shut out from press briefings. I mean, isn't this? I mean, it seems frustrating, but it's also a clear sign of curtailing the information that gets to the public.
Well, I would say two things. It is extremely disturbing. It is inconsistent with the democratic government. If you want to see an interesting example of press conferences, I'm sure it's on YouTube, but if not, it's at the, you can go to the website of the John F. Kennedy Library in the States. President Kennedy's press conferences, which were totally unscripted, and you could tell not only he was open with the media, but he had fun with them, and sort of sparred with them. And it feels as if it didn't just take place in another decade, but on another planet today. But that was an entirely different time. President Kennedy, for example, actually talked to the media off the record about the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba before the invasion, and told them to keep it off the record, and they kept it off the record. The story is supposed to be that after it was a disaster, he said to them, "You guys could have done me a favor by leaking that in advance." That's another world. That's a pre-Watergate world. We don't live in that world anymore. But certainly much more transparency was expected. So that's very concerning. The only part of this, though that limits that, and I'm not arguing for government by leaks or checks and balances by leaks, but the answer to the question, are we being cut off from information, is apparently not. Although I think what is true is that we're getting it in a less healthy way for a functioning democracy.
I would add that still problematic press conferences, bizarre press conferences, are still better than no press conferences.
Well, we can give you bizarre press conferences.
Yes, I'm saying we are. This is what you have now, but what we have with Netanyahu is that he is not ready to give any press conference unless he wants to make a statement to the public, and then he allows for a question or two. But normally, press conference is not part of his menu as a prime minister. And about the possibility of leaks for the future, I think one of the tendencies of this government is to change our administration by bringing in political appointments in the highest echelons of the public sector, which for us would be a novelty because we had some administration in the high levels which is not replaced by an incoming government. And what the present government wants to do is to replace these people with people who are loyal to the government. The main criteria for the selection of the new administrators would be the loyalty to the politicians, because they are making sure that this will be people without qualities. So the only qualities that they will have will be loyalty to their to the people who appoint them, and these people probably will not leak.
Yeah.
So looking into the future, I have this gloomy idea that we may have.
They will leak.
We shall see. I should mention that we have a law about leaks. That I think there is no democracy today in the Western world that has something similar, because according to this law, any revelation of something that came to your knowledge through your office, if you tell it to anybody, you commit a criminal offense without requirement of any damage or harm or anything bad that has occurred. I should add that it is not really enforced, this legislation. But we know that sometimes sleeping dogs wake up. So we have hopes for the future.
I have to ask you, you know, as a reporter and someone who is briefed regularly from the military, and also, I mean, Netanyahu does speak to the press, but it's always off the record. He does very deep background with journalists, and he enjoys it, I think. He seems to. But he doesn't give open press conferences. So, you know, I feel a lot here, reporting from here, and I'm not sure how it is in the US, that a lot of what we're not told is hidden by this disguise of security. Everything is to do with the security situation. We cannot give you that information because of security. We can't give you information on individual Palestinians because of security. So, and I think here, you know, the loyalties of some of the Israeli media, just accept that. And I just wonder what you two think of how, you know, the government uses that as also a way to not give out and not share information with the press.
Well, that's a time-honored tradition. In times of conflict, the government can claim national security interest. We certainly saw that during the Vietnam period. We saw that after 9/11 in the States. I think there's reason to be concerned about that with this administration. It's not hard in the current climate to concoct a case for a national security threat. There's probably never a time when there isn't some level of national security threat in the world in which we're living. So I think there is some concern about that. One of the reasons I made the allusion to the Pentagon Papers case, the argument that was made to repress the publication of the Pentagon Papers was national security, and the court rejected that. So there's at least, you know, precedent for that up to a point. And I think ultimately that's the counterbalance. But for example, to the law that you suggested, one thing that is clearly true is that even if the leaker has committed a crime, which would be true in America as well, if the leaker hands it over to you as a reporter, there's no criminal liability that goes with you having legitimately gotten the papers, as it were, in publishing them. I, as the leaker, would still be liable, but you would not be.
I would say that Israel has real security concerns. So some of the explanations that you get that this is not being told because of security reasons are probably founded. But we know from experience that government always makes overuse and abuse of the argument of national security, and many things that should not be covered get covered by the excuse of national security. This is clear to me, it's obvious. And an example that comes to my mind is we had an awful scandal. It's called the Bus 300 affair, in which 2 terrorists that were captured alive were tortured and afterwards executed. And afterwards, the security services made a cover-up of huge extent in order that this will not be found out. And some time ago, the head of the security services at that time spoke openly about it. He gave the order to kill the terrorists after they have been tortured, and he gave the order to cover up the case. And the Israeli public knows about it because a photographer was at the scene and took picture of the two terrorists coming out of the bus alive, while the official version was that all of them were killed during the storming of the bus. So he was asked, what lesson do you learn from this event, the former head of the security service? So he said, never allow journalists to come near to a scene of operation.
Right.
This was...
It's a great lesson.
Yeah.
The problem with that lesson is that if there's anybody in the area with one of these, that's as good as a journalist,
Well,
right?
I'll also say that the other problem with that, and I've thought about this a lot, especially covering 3 wars in Gaza, the first time the army did let the journalists go into Gaza, and the coverage was very negative against Israel. The second time they didn't let the journalists go in, and the coverage was even worse, because the journalists had to report something, and they could take, their reporting could be whatever they want. Not that they made up stories completely, but they had more freedom to report things that maybe weren't happening, or relying on sources from the other side. And then in the last conflict in 2014, we saw that they let journalists go back in. So, there is this problem, and I also find it a few times I've traveled in the entourage with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the frustration is that there isn't much information shared with the press. And I see, especially my colleagues who work for radio or for internet, where you have to send 24-hour updates on the news, you need to report something. And I think that's a lot of times where you get to what both leaders have called fake news. And both leaders have used that phrase. So I wonder, maybe this fake news comes from the fact that we don't have information shared with the press in an organized way, in a transparent way, but in a leaked kind of preference. We'll give it to this journalist because we like him, and not to this paper because we don't like this paper.
Well, that's the best version of fake news, because there's another version of fake news, which is somebody said, fake news isn't news, it's lies. And to a certain extent, what was called fake news was stories that had no foundation, that are just put out there.
Wow.
Right? The fact that there was massive reporting about where President Obama was born, for example. There are a lot of things one can say about President Obama, positive and negative, but it seems to me you can't have much dispute about where the man was born. But we did. And so that certainly falls into one category of fake news. The other side that you're talking about, in some ways, this is the prosaic kind of checks and balances. It's not just that it's anti-democratic to repress a free press, is that it turns out to be counterproductive, just on a pragmatic level. Because if you distance the press, they've got deadlines, they've got something they've got to fill. We heard a session, very provocative session earlier this morning about press coverage during times of war and war scenes, and studies that suggest that embedded reporters tend to be more sympathetic to the army with which they're embedded. That makes intuitive sense, and apparently these studies have documented that. So excluding the press actually is counterproductive in that case. So I think to a certain extent you do get some of that, and that it turns out that a free press ultimately is better for the authorities, not in the sense of it's going to be positive coverage, but given the fact that there is going to be coverage, you would rather have some control over what that is than to distance it and have them operate on their own.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think one should not accept that it's an excuse for publishing things that are not checked and maybe untrue, because you don't get information from the authorities. I think this is not an excuse for doing bad journalistic work, and because at the end what the media has is the public's trust. And once the public loses its trust in what it gets as reported, saying, well, this poor people do not get information from the government, so they make up stories from their heads. This is very bad for...
It's not just making up stories, but you rely on other sources, you rely on third parties to give you information or their own impressions that can be reported as facts.
Okay, but still, you have to do professional, solid work as a journalist. And speaking about fake news, another danger is a danger of the government pretending to have monopoly of the truth and to be the final arbiter of what is true and what is not true. And in Israel, the government sometimes has a tendency to say, we will tell you what is the truth and what is not truth. And part of the contestation with Shovrim Shtika and B'Tselem is allegation of the government that what they are telling is lies, while we know what is true and what are lies, and you should trust us because we are the government, which is something that should not be accepted.
Talking about, you mentioned the first type of fake news. Obviously with the internet today, you have the mainstream media who I believe tries to do due diligence in terms of media, in terms of journalism and reporting, but then you have blogs and Twitter and you have websites that cater to a specific point of view. So inevitably you're competing with websites that put out fake news. And I just wonder, and also, we're also seeing, I think in the US, you have it, and definitely here, that journalists are more and more becoming political in terms of their reporting, especially in Israel. I see Israeli journalists are reporters and commentators. Their political views are clearly known. So I wonder if there is something to the claims that both of these leaders make, that the press is not honest and not giving fair representation to them.
I think one of the challenges is the fact that the administration makes certain issues political issues doesn't mean they're political issues. So I think the media, mainstream media, has found itself in conflict to a certain extent with the administration over issues that are not properly understood as political issues. If the media were attacking a particular policy of the government, then they're coming in as political partisans. And if they do that, they should at least reveal that's their position on it, and that's counter to at least a big piece of the culture of American media. Certainly the Washington Post, the New York Times, many but not all of the networks try to maintain that level of neutral reporting.
Although we saw in the last election that both the New York Times and the Washington Post came out in support for Hillary in the election campaign.
Well, and as they will tell you, that is supposed to be for the editorial page and not for the front page. And to a certain extent they do that. I think where we saw coverage that I have never seen in my lifetime is as a routine matter on the front page saying the candidate said this and it's not true. The president said this and it's not true. Or in some cases referring to them as statements without justification, without support, and in some cases referring to them as lies. So I think there's a sense in which they have felt they've had to up their level of response to the administration. Now, does that make that a political battle? The media would say no, the administration would say yes. But I think that is if we get to the point where we politicize facts, then everything is political.
I think that there is something I think it's a fact that in some of the conventional media channels there is a lowering of the standard of due diligence because of the competition with the internet and what goes in the social media. And this is something to be regretted and something that a lot has to be done to counter it because it's dangerous. and to the extent that people reflect this phenomenon, there is something in it. I'm not concerned about journalists who have a political view, because I think most people have political views, and I think it's better to be transparent about it. And the fact that you have a political view does not make the story from the facts side of it, that you publish something that is necessarily distorted or biased. If you are a professional, you know to distinguish between your views and the facts that you are describing. And this is the standard that we should strive to.
Well, that's was my next question, and we mentioned it before when we were upstairs, that you know, even in the US, I know that most of the mainstream media has this idea of balance and reporting facts, and then obviously you have news outlets like Fox News, which are clearly not like that, but they still claim to be fair and balanced.
Is there a question
That's not
in
a
that?
question.
Yeah.
No, that's a point. No, there is a question, and maybe it's time where, in terms of the American media, with a leader who is acting towards them in a certain way, for them to also reassess the way that they cover the news.
Yeah, I think that, you know, whether Fox claims to be fair and balanced, they would agree, certainly off the record and probably even on the record, that they are tend to be a conservative supporting station, that they have some liberal commentators, but that by and large, you know, those are the ones like Harel Radi for Haaretz, who we just heard earlier. And by the way, the same thing could be said of MSNBC in the States, which is a left-leaning station and has some conservatives on it. I think CNN tries to do something different. How well they do it is something we can all judge for ourselves. The New York Times tries to do something different. The Washington Post does. The LA Times, there are a few others, try to do something different. The question is, should they let go of that? So should the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN say, we have found that we are now living in such a highly polarized environment that we have to not only have our editorial policy on the editorial page, it will now infuse the papers. This may be a naive view, but I think something very precious would be lost if that happens. That would be, you know this from the Post, that would be so deeply counter to the culture of those institutions. So they're being pushed very hard right now, and I know that there were long editorial meetings, at least at the Times, I know of, probably at the Post as well, about what can we and can't we say on the front page. Can we call the President of the United States a liar? I mean, that's the sort of thing that's happened on you know, handbills and in the internet for a long time. But for a mainstream paper to do that is a major decision. So and I think that's a good thing. I think they should wrestle with that. I think that shouldn't come naturally.
I just want to ask one more question about the Israeli media. Do you think, I mean, you know, we heard from the previous session the talk about right-wing journalists, left-wing journalists, would Haaretz hire Amit Segal or not? And, you know, obviously we're seeing more, I mean, Israel Harel said there isn't that many right-wing journalists, but actually we're seeing the rise of Channel 20. Right now it's on cable. You told me earlier that it won the tender for the Knesset channel, and we are seeing more and more right-wing voices in a traditionally left-wing media. Is the Israeli media going to become more polarized, do you think, in the future?
I think it's a process that is taking place. I think it's becoming more polarized, and I think that there are more journalists who come from the Israeli right, and I think it's a very positive phenomenon. Not coming exactly from the right, I find the strengthening of the right within the Israeli media as a very positive development.
Do we have time for questions? Or no? Any? One or two questions. I'll let Ita. Ita was the first person I saw, so I will let her. Okay.
Thank you. Two brief questions. I'm not sure the answers are brief. The first is, both of you commented on the public response and the public defense of media. And I'm wondering what, if, and if so, what is the responsibility of journalism to educate the public about how to use this? I mean, what is our responsibility to our consumers? We've talked about the damage we might be doing to them. Mata, you talked about that. But what is our responsibility to help the public to understand what we do? Or are we walling ourselves off as well? The second question, we're talking about two countries here, Israel and the United States, different backgrounds, different age, different ethics, and yet describing very similar phenomena. I'm going to bet that they're similar in other countries as well. What are we looking at? If this is a world phenomenon, then it's not enough to describe, to explain it in terms of Trump and Netanyahu. What's the meta explanation that we need here? I warned you, Mata, it wouldn't be short.
Well, you're right. That's not going to get a quick answer. Let's start with the first one, and then a word about the second one, maybe. The first one, I think absolutely the media has a strong obligation not only to defend its own integrity, but to play an educative function as to how information ought to be processed. I mean, the fact is, one of the things, when I talk about all the different power centers that are part of the ultimate system of checks and balances, you could look at how each of them is rated by the American public in public opinion surveys right now, and one is lower than the next. The lowest, by the way, is the United States Congress. But the president's not doing much better, and the media is not doing much better. And religious institutions aren't doing much better, and universities are doing okay, but not much better. So part of this is, so this gets into your second question. This is a crisis of authority in some ways. And if we're living in a time where authority generally is being questioned, I guess that's a good thing. But if sources of expertise are being questioned and delegitimized, that's a very dangerous thing. In the absence of expertise and in the absence of series of responsible and accountable authority, not to be hysteric, but that is a breeding ground for fascism, right? So that's the very serious concern. That the countervailing powers that you look for to check that kind of power are being systemically delegitimized. I think part of it, too, is that technology just makes it possible to get access to billions of pieces of undifferentiated information. That's different from knowledge. That's just information. So the trick is how you turn that information into knowledge. That's the role of educated institutions like the media, like universities, should be the role of government. But if what we're left with is raw information out there that can be manipulated by anybody, then I think that is very dangerous. And it's not surprising that every trend that I just talked about is nationwide, because this is all is international, because all of this is networked well beyond national borders.
To be realistic, I don't think that it's the role of media people to be educators in the formal sense or usual sense of being an educator. But they should educate in the way they function, they perform. This is the best way to educate, by keeping to professional standards. I don't think that there is a better way. Now, if we made the impression that we are describing two personalities, and this is the whole story, I'm afraid we did a lousy job. Because, of course, it's not the story. The story is a crisis of democracies that is taking place in many democratic countries, and Israel and the US are included in this club. And I don't think that I can go now into an analysis of this. But I will say something that gives hope for Israel. And I think that Israelis have a very embedded, strong anti-authority sentiment. And I think facing tendencies of a democratic regime turning into an authoritarian regime, this anti-authority sentiment is a very important factor in trying to stop these tendencies.
I think there's one more question. Only one more, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, my question was partly covered by the second part of the question, which you said you didn't want to analyze. But we have been talking about the changes in media. How much is the changes in media the reason? I mean, like the 24-hour news cycle, the internet, you talked about the fact that we all have to get something out there, even if we have to rely on other sources. So, I mean, it's like Carl Bernstein talked about the best available version of truth. And now you have to have the best available version of truth every hour, immediately on the internet. Is the crisis for media that we see in a lot of countries? I mean, you can say that it's special case America, special case Israel, but we have Turkey, we have Poland, we have Hungary, we have Russia. I mean, this new authoritarian that are all delegitimizing the press and also delegitimizing the rule of law and the judiciary. Is it an internal problem of the press that the press get legitimized, or is it, and why is this coming in country after country after country?
Thank you.
I think some of it is beyond just the 24-hour cycle. I think that is part of it, but it's obviously this is overdetermined. You think back in the States to a time when there were 3 major networks. It seems hard to remember now. A man named Walter Cronkite used to always end his nightly broadcast and saying, "And that's the way it is." Tuesday, May 9th, 2017. And I can tell you, as someone who watched him every night, right up through when I was in university, when he said that's the way it is, that's the way it was. And we kind of accepted that. But we also accepted in that same university that these were the books one should read to have been well read, and there was a canon of works, and that is broken down. No one would make that assertion today. The canon that we read would be considered to be Western-centric and male-centric, and it was. So to a certain extent, there is a splintering in a positive way of opening us up to many more influences, but that process is indeterminate once it starts. So I think we have not yet reached a stasis point, and it's very hard to interpret the time that we're living through. I think of the famous line attributed to Zhou Enlai about the French Revolution when he said, "Too soon to tell." It's certainly too soon to tell, about the period that we're living through right now, which is why I say vigilance but not overkill. I think there are so many ways in which the pushback has been remarkable. I mean, just another one that's quite recent. Twice, President Trump tries to have his immigration ban put in place. Twice it gets stopped by the courts, and it stops. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And this is a president who knows how to ad hominem criticize judges. And he does, but it doesn't change, right? So there are other sources of legitimacy, and I think in this country too. I mean, in many ways, we've been describing the differences between the two countries almost as a cartoon version, because if we were doing the same discussion in another country, I can imagine the similarities would swamp the differences, and that's what we'd be talking about. So I think in many ways, these other sources of legitimacy are very strong. So I should just end on a happy note. But it's a worrisome time. It's a worrisome time because some of these core values are being challenged in a way that I certainly haven't seen in my lifetime. And so that has people called to recommit in a way that they perhaps haven't before. But, I have to tell you, I was one of about 100,000 people in the streets of Washington, D.C., marching for science. Now, who would have thought that was possible? So it's an interesting time we live in.
Well, when I said that I don't want to analyze it, it is because I think that the story about what's happening now in democracies is much broader than media issues. It has to do with socio-economical issues, with many different issues. It's a complex story, and we cannot do it now. The only remark that I would like to do about what is unique to the media issue and what is should be a ground for concern is the fact that we have now people who have their own media world, which is restricted to what they want to hear. And the basic idea of a free media was that you have contradicting views coming to the same ears. The different ears meet different views. And we are losing this difference in the media exercise. And I think this is something that is endangering the democratic idea, one of few others.
Thank you very much to both of you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
I want to thank Professor Kremnitzer, Professor Lawrence, both Eglas. Thank you for,
Pleasure.
and thank you, Justice Dorner, for leading the way into this panel. This concludes our conference, the second conference run by the Jerusalem Press Club about the freedom of the press. I want to thank the hundreds of people who have been following us live on social media, and I want to thank our able staff of JPC headed by, don't blush, Vanessa Kacheginsky, Raya Koval, and the rest of the crew. Thank you very much. I don't know what about you, but I think it was a very successful conference, and we hope to meet next time. Thank you.